2 p.m. has commenced, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, to all of our loyal following that has joined the first two webinars, we welcome you back for the third, the trifecta webinar. And today we'll be talking about, you can see the title, the Air Jordan phenomenon. Today we are talking about number 23, also number 45. He's retired 3 times from the game of basketball, played professional basketball and baseball for the Chicago White Sox, known forever as the GOAT, greatest of all time. We're talking about Michael Jordan, but another GOAT that I see, a huge colleague and close confidant of mine, John Houlihan, joins me today. And John Houlihan is a senior marketing director for AIB Merchant Services. AIB Merchant Services is Outlet Irish Bank, payment side of the business. In addition to that, he's been in the game for more than 20 years in marketing. There's not much creative that he has not touched. He's been in food and bev and spirits in the US and North America, also in Europe. In addition to that, I knew from the first moment I met John, he was deeply empathetic, unbelievably thoughtful, a master linguist with words. So today you'll be delighted by the words he brings. And more impressively, he has global expertise. He's been following kind of North American marketing since he was a kid, been exposed to Jordan. He'll talk a bit today about how the Chicago Bulls had stopping power in Ireland, where he's from, and some of his companies that he's been a part of. The best a man can get. He's worked for Gillette, and there's not a spirit he hasn't touched. Worked for Heineken, which is majorly affiliated with the Champions League. In addition to that, Pernod Ricard, and then also Molson Coors, which I think some of those, if anybody that drinks alcohol, you probably touched one of those at some point. And last but not least, also a big NBA fan, season ticket holder in Canada for the Toronto Raptors, and also season ticket holders for our tri-state Brooklyn Nets. So thank you, John, so much for joining us. I appreciate you being here. You know, I get the fortunate blessing, some would say, to work with him on a weekly basis. So thank you for being here, John. And then myself, for anyone that hasn't been to the first 2 webinars or got exposed to who I am Brian Senna, the founder and principal of EverWonder. EverWonder is a full service creative agency. Our goal is to help brands build, grow, and accelerate their businesses. You know, we like to help clients play in the art of what's possible. I think today we're going to talk about lessons in brand evolution, because I myself have been super passionate about branding since I was a young kid. I believe brands have the power to give us an emotional response, stick with long-lasting memories, and then also those somatic brain moments that you have in your mind that you just remember that are immortalized from a kid. Whether it's the products you've eaten, the commercials you've seen, these are the things that stick, and that's why I love advertising. So why are we here today? When we talk about brand evolution, our goal today is to take you behind the scenes into why Nike was able to build what I would consider one of the most prolific, successful brands in the world under the Air Jordan brand. So most people don't know this, but Air Jordan is a sub-brand of Nike. And they did this by creating one of the greatest and the most successful celebrity partnerships and athletic partnerships with Michael Jordan. For those of you who are on this who don't know who Michael Jordan is, if you don't have any background who he is, I'd be surprised by that. However, if you don't, he is, when I say the greatest of all time, he's referred to as the greatest of all time, not just for what he did on the court, but the way he was able to transcend culture and get into a subculture, inspire the youth, travel the entire world. The Chicago Bulls, what was super interesting is they used to travel to other continents. And when they would show up and they would walk off the plane, major populations and large groups would be meeting them. This was in the mid 80s, late 80s, early 90s. That's not something you saw with athletes, which really made the NBA and America really rise to this level of fame that we've never seen before. And so today, our goal is to kind of reverse engineer some of what happened inside the boardroom, talk about who Sonny Vaccaro is as a key player for the Nike marketing team, specifically for basketball. And then when we mention reverse engineer, it's also getting into the heart of when you hear the phrase, how to be like Mike, what is the underlying duality and some of the connections back to how brands can really be successful in their idea of finding their character, creating resilience in the market, creating stopping power in the market, and ultimately building a legacy. I think this is something that is what we all seek after. We've heard the phrase lightning in a bottle. Most of our clients that come to us, and I think, John, when you've worked with other partners and large-scale campaigns, we've all been tasked with this idea of create magic. We want to drive new leads. We want everybody to hear who we are. And the reality is magic takes a lot of work. Magic takes time. It takes commitment. It takes a lot of thought put behind it. And the other bit is, how does someone like Michael Jordan continue to be a topic of conversation, to be talked about from sports analysts and he hasn't even played the game in 20 years. His last season was the 2002, 2003 season. And so part of the rest of this table of contents, you'll see why Nike bet everything on red. Red is somewhat of a metaphor, right? It's the color of the Chicago Bulls. It's the color they brought into the shoes and the brand. But red is also the color of power. And they had this idea of how do we create a rebellious brand who disrupts not only athletics, but also disrupts just culture at large. The next is $5,000 fines and the birth of a rebel brand. A really interesting story around what Nike committed to pay in terms of these $5,000 fines and how much they were racking them up. The fourth, fifth, and sixth sections really get into the heart of the practicality around how true brands leave legacies and ultimately how legacies are born. This idea of game respecting game and why other folks inside of conference rooms and inside of briefs will say, hey, listen, we want you to design a brand like Nike. We want you to write our campaign slogan to be like, just do it. You'll hear that often said about Apple. I want to look like Apple. This is the idea that game respects game and the rising tide raises all ships. And then the last bit is this idea of negotiating the most lucrative deal in history. And what our goal is here is to talk to you guys about how negotiating the most lucrative deal is really about the thought. It's not just about creating passive revenue streams, but it's around how do we understand our inherent value and maximize that value. So thanks for joining. Thanks for coming on this journey with us. John, anything to add there? Or do you want me to jump in?
Let's jump in.
Okay, perfect. So how to be like Mike? What does this phrase mean? Dating back to the early 80s, late 80s into the early 90s, Gatorade actually created a campaign called How to Be Like Mike. And when I was younger, I actually thought this campaign was very much connected to Nike, and that's the power of branding. But Gatorade jumped into this idea of they recognized an athlete who had relatability, who had characteristics that most people wanted. And it was that drive, it was that passion, it was that commitment to success. And these campaigns were just different depictions of Michael Jordan doing normal things. And really the tagline was, you want to be like Mike. But I bring this up because I think building brands is ultimately about building trust. And trust only forms when you can have your message resonated. So if you've ever heard this concept of why-based selling, so most people know what they do. A lot of people kind of think about how they do it, but why they do certain things and why companies and organizations and brands, the why is really the key passion, because the why creates this idea of how you can connect to your belief set. And the reason why Nike and Air Jordan, I think, are such a powerful thing that we're talking about today is because most people see the success. Most people see the fact that there are lines forming in small sneaker shops inside of Brooklyn and New York, still all over the world. When a new pair of Air Jordans drops, there is a sub-market. There's a whole culture that's been created called sneakerheads. Shoes will sell for $1,600, $1,700 a pair. They'll be wrapped in plastic at auctions. This level of success, almost cult-like following, doesn't just happen overnight. And I think when I hear people come into conference rooms and say, hey, we want that, that starts a lot earlier than that, because Michael Jordan actually wasn't always successful. He was born in Brooklyn, New York. His family moved down to Wilmington, Delaware. And I like this story, Wilmington, North Carolina. And I like this story because when his family moved to North Carolina, he had 3 other siblings. There was a lot of basketball being played, but his older brother was what drove him to be better and better. He ended up going to University of North Carolina. He was a Tar Heel. And his freshman year, he was actually cut. When I heard this bit of news when I was younger, I was like, there's no way. That must have mean he just didn't get playing time. And no, he was actually cut from the team. And his coach recognized that there was a lot more in the tank of Michael Jordan. And so this story started long before he was ever signed with the Chicago Bulls. And hearing no motivated him. If you could think about a fire pit and that fire starting to blaze, when you throw another log on and you stoke that flame within inside of Michael Jordan was burning incandescently. Every time someone told him no, he would take hits and he would move forward twice as fast. And I think that is, we're watching a culture now around venture capitalism, around private equity, around building businesses. And these individuals, to determine what they're going to invest in, they have to find a founder and a partner or a team that is going to take the hits, the resiliency, and keep moving forward. Because we know with the market that we're in now, inflation is crazy, costs are crazy. It's a tough time to be successful, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. And so just irrespective of the industry we're in, I think the statistics that we're seeing now is that 75% of individuals want to understand what they want to buy long before they ever meet a salesperson. So that means individuals are doing their own research. They're leaning on ChatGPT. They're going on Google. They're doing their searches. They're reading reviews, and they're compiling a whole story inside their mind of what they want long before they're ever sold. So to connect all this, how do we be like Mike? Think of this as a metaphor. Think about you as your brand, your company, even your own personality. How do you create something that ends up having an iconic image? So when you see the Nike swoosh, or you see this beautiful image here, you know that this is Michael Jordan just by a glance. That's what we're all trying to create. And so this quote is something that really jumps out to me, because when we think of the idea of failure, failure is often connected with really negative thoughts. It's often connected with things of like, oh, you don't want to fail. The reality here is this quote is, I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. Embodied in this is this idea of no matter how much I fail, I'm going to learn and I'm going to move forward. And in this case, forward is not always straight ahead, right? You could go side to side, you can go backwards, but as long as you keep pushing for diligence and drive, this is what we need to do. And so how do we take this to a practical level, to what we're all talking about here from a perspective of marketing? When we meet adversity in a market, let's say we have a LinkedIn campaign that's live. If you're not getting the leads, the impressions that you desired right off the bat, what can you learn? Doesn't mean that that tactic is a failure just yet. You have to understand and take the data and use that data as a mechanism to be resilient and stay consistent on strategy. So the next key point is, how do we fail and continue to move forward? I think it's about finding character. And in my version, in my vision, is how do we be like Mike, is to develop and understand our character. I think whenever you're building a brand, let's say you already have your logos, colors, type, fonts, you already have this in place and you like the way you look. What is the underlying character? What is your value set that you live by? What tenets do you have? What tenets lead through creative that will drive a big idea? And so some of the examples we see here around resilience, perseverance, and discipline, this is what Nike saw inside of Michael Jordan that allowed them to make them their main focus. And so I want to kick over to John, because John, I think you have a lot of thought into this around the duality between nature and nurture with inside of Michael Jordan alone, and also the idea of how character can drive brands.
Yeah, so I think I just was thinking to myself there, Brian, as you were chatting, that campaign, Be Like Mike, was a 1995 campaign, which is sort of hard to believe. I think for me, a couple of things that I observed in it. Firstly, from a European perspective, we wouldn't have seen it because it was a North American only piece. But I think what was really interesting about it was, and you've sort of alluded to it a little there, whereby Jordan has long since retired, and yet by the same token, his star power persisted for so long after retirement that in 2015, when Gatorade decided to rerun that campaign in support of their own 50th anniversary, it was run globally. So it talks an awful lot, to the strength of the creative and its continuing resonance in culture. But I think also, to what you've been sort of summing up very nicely there around Jordan still to this day being a ridiculously bright star, and the fact that that creative, as they reran it in 2015, was untouched. That's 20 years after they ran it the first time. That's every business's dream, that you're able to repurpose the campaign like that and still be able to derive so much success of it so many years later. I think the other piece it's interesting for me as we talk about the Jordan side of things as well. I've been reading a lot of Gladwell's Tipping Point in recent weeks, and hard to escape this feeling that Jordan sort of straddles this very interesting combination of the nature-nurture debate. So, for those who aren't familiar with the concept, the nurture piece being this idea that anybody who's prepared to spend 10,000 hours in pursuance of excellence at your craft can actually achieve that. And then the other side versus the nature piece, this, ridiculously unique talent. And I think, fair to say, instinctively, everyone would say Jordan sits on the, obscene talent side of the equation. But I think the lesser seen piece, the lesser understood side of it, around his star power, is this sort of relentless obsession with perfection. So spending hours and hours on the court or in downtime, trying to perfect these incremental elements to the game, probably seen as relatively superfluous to most people, be it fans or players alike. And yet him putting an emphasis on all of those little pieces being super important in a way in which he can pull them all together to make him the best version of himself. And I think that's why probably there's only a handful of exceptions in the world of sort of athletic brand ambassadors that could possibly be attached to a brand who have that sort of power. So I think it's a pretty impressive feat. And I think all the more so as we're going to get into on foot of, you know, if we think back in the day when Nike signed Jordan, they couldn't possibly have known all of this. So it was instinctual. How amazing is that? I think that a marketing department were able to sort of foresee, you know, probably not to the depth and length of what has become the case, but that they were able to foresee so many aspects of Jordan's star power is just truly phenomenal.
Really is. And so why Nike bet everything on red? Let's take you through a little bit of the story. Just rewind the clocks back to the mid 80s. So the year before I was born, a lot of this stuff happened. But in 1984, the background of this, what we see as Jordan today, right? For those of you that have seen The Last Dance on Netflix documentary that was created, Jordan's attitude and charisma is still exactly where it was then, where it is today. And those of you who have heard reference, et cetera, you can watch the proliferation of an athlete like Caitlin Clark now being signed by Nike. Caitlin Clark is the modern day kind of Michael Jordan in the WNBA. And a lot of these things are happening, but let's just go back to what celebrity endorsement, let's see what athletic partnerships look like. In 1984, Nike had an individual on their payroll by the name of Sonny Vaccaro. Sonny Vaccaro's whole talent was, as a talent scout, he was trying to find the next opportunity to sign someone that embodied Nike's brand. But Nike's brand at the time was a running shoe. It was a running brand. It embodied Phil Knight. Phil Knight, as CEO and chair of Nike at the time, was talking about running shoes. The basketball division was very small. Nike was in that division because they know that they needed to compete with Adidas and Converse. And this competition, they were far away from being the market leader. Most individuals don't know this, but Nike only had, I think it was 12 to 14%, John, at the time.
Yeah, but just about 14% market share, yeah.
From a market share perspective. And then Adidas and Converse had prolific basketball players in their corner. We're talking about Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, et cetera. And so this idea of an athletic partnership wasn't brand new. That's not why Nike won. This idea of why Nike bet everything on red is they took a wider funnel approach and they niched down to this really, really particular focus and said, we're going to go after one athlete, not 4 or 5. One athlete is going to create a sub-brand, not multiple. They wanted to transcend this idea of Nike and they wanted to create Air Jordan to create the mystique. They had in their mind this idea of we want to target cultural timing, we want to be rebellious in nature, and most importantly, we want a unique approach to all of this. So the whole notion of this is they began negotiating because Sonny Vaccaro saw a video of UNC when Michael Jordan was just a sophomore in college. And he was playing alongside a very, very strong basketball player in the Hall of Fame now by the name of James Worthy. And when it came to the last play of the game, UNC was down a point. And the play was designed to pass off to Jordan, not to use James Worthy as the final shot. Why that was so precarious is because you had this young player who was unproven, surrounded by really great seniors and juniors at UNC. And the way Jordan handled that was with such poise, such calmness, and he almost knew he was going to sink the shot. He rose up to the game moment. At that point, there was this notion of if we sign this guy, we take our entire marketing budget, we build a brand around this. We believe this is going to give us the leg up we need to close that market share and move from 14% closer to the 40. So it all started with these negotiations where it said, well, Jordan, we want you. We want to create a brand. And the conversations were not actually positive or lucrative at all for Nike because Jordan wanted to be in a Converse or Adidas shoe. He was very clear that he didn't want to go near Nike. And so why a lot of this stuff started to evolve is because Nike had this vision and said, all right, well, here's what we're going to create. They sold a vision to Michael Jordan that really played into this idea of a little bit of his God complex and a little bit of this notion of Michael Jordan himself thought he was the best. And so when we talk about why betting on red works, I mentioned cultural timing. At this point in time, there was a subculture, there was a street culture that was very much, we're not going to wear the conventional outfit. We're going to wear brighter colors. There was a hip hop culture that was starting to emerge and develop that was connected to sports as well. And when you're not an industry leader, you have to think different into cultural timing and tap into moments. That is something that whenever I'm working on briefs, I'm not seeing that as an element. I'm not seeing brands come to us and say, hey, Brian, can you and your team help us find some cultural moment to tap into? Oftentimes we'll see TikTok rise to the top as a social platform and brands say, I need to be on TikTok. It's like, well, that's not disrupting culture. That's just jumping in kind of to this movement of in the sea of sameness. And so part of the story as well is when Sonny Vaccaro made this pitch into the marketing team, and then the marketing team brought this to Phil Knight, CEO of Nike, he was very much against it. He was against making such a big bet and being so disruptive. And it was this perseverance and vision, but also selling the idea of creative that really mattered. A concept that I keep thinking about now is we design a lot of things as an agency. And when designers come to me and say like, oh, well, I don't want to have to sell things. Everything we do is a sales process, whether you're selling an idea, a vision, design, whatever it is, you have to sell it to get people on board and to make believers. And so I think other than this, a quote here, we need you in these shoes, not so you have meaning in your life, but so we can have meaning in ours. This whole thing is pulled from, the conference room scene in the movie Air, which was just recently made. I think it was 2 years ago. That was a Ben Affleck, Matt Damon production. I would encourage everybody to see it because this was a story not about Jordan. This was a story about marketing. This was a story about the power of brand. And why this quote means so much is the moment those shoes got strapped onto Jordan and were designed for Jordan. We'll talk in a moment about the $5,000 fines, but this is where we've now broken out of regular celebrity partnership and regular athletic partnership. And we've moved into this rebellious appeal of saying, we're going to do what no one else is doing. But they did it in a calculated way. I want to be very clear that being bold and being disruptive has to have thought, has to have meaning, but also needs to be done in a way that's methodical. And I think Nike really nailed that. So this was the Jordan 1s. Obviously, this is a color that is completely innovative. This is not what it looked like in the 80s. But John, just real quick, I wanted to get your thoughts. You have a lot of experience in food and bev and spirits. You have a lot of experience in large-scale consumer brands. Is there anything that maybe you could connect to with what jumped out about either being rebellious or connected to you of why this is special with Nike?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's quite a few points jumped out for me. I think you touched on the Sonny Vaccaro piece. I think let's call it a spade a spade. We're talking about 1984 here. If you take a step back, organizationally speaking, marketing is a discipline organizationally for about 30 years. So far from sort of ruling the roost or leading business strategy out, very much playing second fiddle to elsewhere. So I think the appointment of Sonny and then the erstwhile designing of such a rebellious strategy internally should not be underestimated around what it is that he had to do in order to convince the stakeholders, be it Knight and others, in there to be able to move with him in order to be able to originate something so defining, so game changing. I think that's the piece that jumps out most for me, to be perfectly honest. A huge amount of respect. And we shouldn't forget, I think it isn't black and white here. There's a lot of gray whereby that marketing department had done a fine job on the Nike basketball brand before Sonny arrived. As we said, they had 14% market share in a market that was dominated by Converse, 40% plus, and Adidas, who were spending like money was going out of fashion. So they were up against some serious competition, and on very meager budgets and limited resource, they derived very profitable market share for Nike. I think what Vaccaro did was to take them to the next level. And I think, incredibly high risk strategy, high reward around this idea of effectively a hedgehog strategy and gambling everything on Nike's one strength that they held as an advantage over their competitive set, being that they knew the player base better than the others did. That was absolutely true, but trying to make that come to fruition is something entirely different. So to be able to get that over the line as a department huge kudos, huge respect, because I think that's a challenge that most marketers would be able to identify almost in an annual planning cycle, whereby they've got that delicate balance between risk, not enough risk in your plan and you're considered to be unambitious, too much risk and you're seen as being a maverick solo marketer. So, we walk a delicate tightrope most days. So what they achieved, I think, should never be underestimated. But not just that, I think the fact that they were able to effectively make that strategy work, and because we're all now sitting in 2024 comfortably able to look back and say what a resounding success that it was. I mean, in the first year alone, for Air Jordan, they derived $162 million in sales, completely unprecedented
In the
and mind
80s.
blowing. Yeah, in the 80s.
Yeah.
One of the most challenging decades economically that the world has ever seen. They created a brand proposition so culturally relevant, so game changing, that despite people's challenges in the pocket, they went out and bought en masse that hitherto unknown shoe. So really, really amazing.
It really is. I appreciate that. And the quote on the screen here, rather than have the athlete wear our shoes, we create the shoe around the athlete. This is tapping into something that I think is extremely special and makes the story more worthy, is that the research and development department at Nike was largely spending and investing inside of the running shoe and the future of running shoes. But there was also this other juxtaposition back into the athletic shoe when we think of tennis and we think of basketball. And so when they came to the R&D department and said, hey, we need a shoe that's going to embody air, right? We need a shoe that's going to embody this type of personality. Marketing is not just about the front-facing tagline or the front-facing design that's out in the wild. It happens so much behind the scenes in terms of what you can actually talk about. Nike had the R&D and the investment. They also had the commitment to the athlete in the sense of saying, hey, Jordan is going to embody something deeper on his feet. And going into the next section, we talk about these $5,000 fines. Why that matters is betting everything on red. Red is a disruptive color. It's super powerful, but also they did that in the shoe. And so I think the story that we'll get to is around how back in the NBA in that era, you were given a fine if 51% of your shoe was not white. And the reason being is they wanted the shoes to be able to blend in and be neutral to the uniforms. And so in the NBA, you were given fines if you had a very colorful shoe. And Nike said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to go completely off the reservation. And we're going to have not only 51% be color, we're only going to have 10% of the shoe be white. And we're going to make the entire thing black and red. And we know that these $5,000 fines are going to come our way, but we're going to pay them. Why? Because it's going to be newsworthy. It's going to tap into the story of rebellion. And what the press did is they took this and said, look at how much Nike is now going off and being their own rebels. And so just before we get into this idea of the birth of a rebel brand, I wanted to just pragmatically go back to what are the 4 key points that you have to do to not only create successful partnerships, but also build brands. First one, you have to be smart about cultural timing. You have to understand the market that you're in, because I think when it comes down to where we are from a technology perspective, where the proliferation of AI is going, how social media is changing the way people consume and look at content. We hear about things around TikTok is going to replace Google in the sense of people are going to use TikTok as a search engine. That now leads you into know that your responses have to be short form video rather than just long form text. So cultural timing is a lot around what's happening in the world, not only the economy, but how people interact, how they talk, how they communicate. 20 years ago, online dating apps were not a thing. Now individuals don't meet in person, they meet digitally. These are things that brands have to consider when they think about campaigns and they think about where they're going to live. Nike knew that. Nike knew the fandom that was being created inside the stadium. They knew the fandom that was created with advertising, with key spots that they had on TV. So their marketing mix not only tapped into cultural timing, they had a subculture developed. Second key point is a unique approach. I think unique is more important than ever because I mentioned AI. You're probably getting emails that are coming your way where they've scrubbed your website and they've shown you a couple of keywords and they've hit you with a canned message. And you could tell a robot sent this or a robot drafted it. And that's offensive, right? It's offensive when someone feels like they're making something personalized and it's not. And so a unique approach is how can you cut through the noise in a very, very noisy market? Because people will listen. They will listen when they see uniqueness. They will listen when they see something special. And ultimately when something's personal to them. And Jordan actually made things personal to individuals by how he played on the court. The quote that I love most from Michael Jordan's mouth was, he said, give 100% all the time, because you never know who's watching, and it might only be once. And I think that quote is something that has always stuck with me, because, if you've ever gone to a networking event or you've gone to a conference and you feel like the conference was underattended, or maybe you felt like there was only one person in the audience, we have no idea the power of what that one person can take and can take away. And so you have to put your best on the field, and you have to, or the metaphorical field in the conference room. So a unique approach is a big one. The next third point is a rebellious appeal. Being a rebel doesn't necessarily mean bad, right? Being a rebel doesn't necessarily mean forgetting about modern conventions. It's finding a way to say, if 51% of something is going a certain way, how do I carve out an element of the market to specifically niche or be more targeted? And the last key point is to go all in. When I say go all in, what I mean is being able to collectively come together as a marketing team, as a supply chain organization, as a finance team, as a cross-functional group of individuals, and go all in a strategy and stick to that strategy. In my experience, 12 years in marketing, 7 years in finance, the times that I've seen failure is when individuals abandon a strategy too soon, or they implement a shotgun strategy where they continually change and they just spray and pray. Develop a significant strategy, stay consistent, go all in on that strategy, and you will, over time, you will start to see success. So getting into Sonny Vaccaro, I want to just say one other thing about him. If you search around on Google now, you'll still see him giving interviews. He's largely retired now. But to hear and see his character embodied in the movie Air, and to understand the nuances of what he was committed to do, the embodiment of this individual, right? Old school, through and through, traditional person. What I love most about listening to what he said is he was committed. When he would deliver his vision and his thoughts, he heard a lot of no's, he heard a lot of resistance, and he heard the conventions. And so I don't know the saying directly, but I think it's something to the tune of that first they're going to laugh at you, then they're going to call you crazy, and then they're going to worship you. Like, this pathway, you have to expect as human behavior and as brand marketers, you're going to hear a lot of no's and, oh, that won't work. If you've ever tried to soft pitch your parents on something and you're like, oh, I want to move to California, or I'm going to take a trip for 3 weeks. The first element, I don't see it, is parents being unbelievably supportive and saying that's a brilliant idea. Normally it's met with 25 questions. It's met with a lot of no's. It's met with a lot of resistance. But the reality is, if you can't sell them on that vision and you can't make them feel comfortable, or you can't expel the fear that's connected to that, maybe the idea is not that strong. But what made me really excited about Sonny Vaccaro is he knew what he saw and he felt it. And he also made some bets in the past that he lost. But when you feel it in your bones and you could communicate that and you can get evangelists and believers behind you, that's how you start to build brands. And so getting into this, again, we see another quote, a shoe is just a shoe until somebody steps into it, then it has meaning. This was in a conference room. It was off the fly. It was not rehearsed. This is now the third quote we're showing inside of this webinar around this embodiment of a shoe. But don't think about a shoe as this material of, things sewn together and stitched together. It's a symbol, and symbols can happen in a lot of ways. One of the things we talk about is the 7 tenets of primal branding. And one of those tenets is the creation story. Where did things come from? This idea of the Air Jordan brand, that creation story is wild. But you also have something called the pagans, or the non-believers. That's another tenet of primal branding. There's going to be haters. And you have to think about the pagans and non-believers the same way you think about the believers, because that's how you get to these disruptive campaigns. So, John, anything in terms of what I'm saying about Sonny, in terms of the brand, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I think it'd probably be hard pressed to find a marketer who couldn't identify with a lot of the challenges you've been sort of articulating there, Brian. Because I think, it's sort of two phases of this for me that sort of stand out as super impressive. There's sort of that bravery in the initial instance in pursuance of the Jordan strategy to start with. And, not to sort of in any way, pour cold water on what they achieved, because it was obviously a monumental achievement in doing it. You could easily have seen a case whereby they sort of sat in their laurels and, looked to try and, make a cash cow of it without putting too much effort in. And yet the second part of that strategy, the desire and the energy with which they pursued exploiting the strategy to to the uplift of the company is unbelievable. Like, it's relentless. I think we talked about the designing of the shoe, and that was a complete first. This idea that, it's no longer considered just a privilege for an athlete to have a shoe sponsor, but actually that the athlete will become the epicenter of the brand. Completely transformative. And we think about that as pretty much a given these days. So many brands are doing it. But again, cast your mind back to 1984. I'm pretty sure as a bunch of marketers walking in to meet their colleagues, etc., they would have been faced with accusations of being completely insane and off their rocker. So the fact that they were able to, effectively transform organizational culture to get behind them and support what they wanted to do, amazing. And not to be discounted. I think beyond that, then, when you get down into, really, really ballsy, to be perfectly frank, around taking on the NBA. We talk about big, bold, unapologetic colors onto the sneaker, but the reality is it must have been a pretty formidable thing to be walking into NBA offices to say that we know the rules, but we're going to break them anyway. I think that alone is impressive. But then to actually very, very cleverly take what was a super negative around the $5,000 fine and somehow transform that to possibly the most successful PR strategy of all time. That, we, as I say, we know the rules, but we've decided, this is so important, we're going to continue to break them no matter what you say. I think that's unbelievable. And you touched on it a little earlier there, Brian. I think the piece for me as an erstwhile marketer that continues to be impressive is a creative innovation. So every year since 1985, there's been an annual release of a Nike Air Jordan to look forward to. The idea that you're building this community around the excitability of a release every year. What is it that they're going to come up with next? Now, that originally sort of excited the basketball community, but as we know, Air Jordan then started to transcend basketball itself and become a definer of culture in a much larger sense than just basketball. And so this huge swathes of people across many different communities who were waiting for this release. So it became collectible, covetable, and I think in the language then of CFOs, incredibly profitable. So as I touched on, obviously 164 million in its first year, but north of 3.5 billion a year now in 2024 into the Nike P&L. I think that alone probably says just how ridiculously successful a strategy it has been, and amazing to think that it's still the most successful driver of the Nike P&L 40 years later. Honestly, there should be some sort of statue out there, I think, for Vaccaro in a marketing world, not a sporting one. Just an unbelievable achievement.
And exactly to your point around obstacle or opportunity, paying those fines created this rebellious nature, but also Nike went after the best in the game. If you think about some of the other athletes that they've connected and partnered with, we're talking about Roger Federer, we're talking about Serena Williams, we're talking about LeBron James. They're going after a certain persona and a certain kind of best in the game mentality. To be able to define that and stand behind that, I mean, you don't necessarily know that someone's going to be the best in the game. The fact that LeBron James is older than I am and still playing competitively, still playing at the Olympic level and winning a gold medal, you could say and argue he's nowhere near Michael Jordan. It doesn't matter. The idea is he's put in 2 decades of seasons, played directly out of high school, and he's a Nike sponsored athlete, and these Nike sponsored athletes get their own dedicated shoe. They've created this model, and we're bringing it up here, not to gloat just over the NBA and talk about these successes. The idea of this webinar is, how do we get into this idea of building a legacy? And some of the tenets that we're highlighting here around making a commitment and consistent strategy and sticking with that strategy, around developing a persona and then living and breathing that persona. I don't think there's any greater example of folks that are developing a persona and sticking to it. It's like, I would love to see the whiteboard or in the conference room of how they develop the greatest of all time type personas and saying, okay, we're going to go to this tennis player and invest early in their career and almost see the future. I don't know how Nike can be prophets as they are, but I think that's a commitment to personas. And I often get in the conference room when I'm working with clients, they don't want to invest in personas. They think it's boring or throwaway. They don't want to put that into their marketing automation tools because it doesn't feel like it's a direct driver of revenue. But the reality is your personas and how you stick to it and how that develops your personality is ultimately how you leave legacies. And so, coming to this logo immortalized in this, that silhouette is Jordan doing his little foul line dunk. And it's not little, by the way. It's how he's redefined air and getting air. But the two big elements that I see in terms of brands leaving legacies, the first is this idea of emotional connection and identity. I mentioned when I was kind of introducing Ever Wonder as an agency, shameless plug here, but it's the truth, is in the build, grow, accelerate facet, the build piece is your identity. That's how young brands, startups, as well as enterprise brands understand this identity of how it's going to move and transcend past logos, colors, fonts, typography. That's one element. Those are your visual assets. But really, how do you create believers and community around this? A lot of it's personality. A lot of it's the values you create and live by. Values are not just an exercise that can live in the back of an employee handbook. They're not just something that can get painted on a wall and not seen. One of the most inspiring things about Nike is that Phil Knight used to have kind of these Nike 10 commandments, so to speak, taped up and painted on various areas of the business. And he would just point to them in a conference room. If something wasn't being displayed, just point. And in the movie Air, you actually see throughout the various scenes and crescendos in the story, they zoom into one of these values and you can see it. And that is something that when you can see it and go, oh my goodness, like I understand how that manifests. That's one big. So emotional connection identity is what your consumers feel as well. It's almost why when you see like little small golden retrievers and pictures of golden retrievers on Instagram videos, everybody feels this sense of love. There's an identity connected to that. There's a cuddly nature. There's a safeness to it. You don't have to know and pet a golden retriever to kind of feel that. And that identity could be your brand, or you could be something more disruptive and focused and abrasive. But what you choose and how you put that into your marketing develops legacy. And so the next bit is resilience during crisis. I feel crises will happen. I mean, nothing can be beautiful and great forever. There's always going to be some adversity that comes to be, whether that's economical, whether that is a tough year with your P&L from cash flow, whether that is quality issues. We hear everything that's going on with Boeing right now. When you're in the headlines and it's not a good place to be, how you could respond to that in crisis and how you can stay true to that identity. That's big. I mean, Jordan wasn't always on top of his game. Touted sometimes as a gambler, touted sometimes as, playing cards and going out with his teammates, etc. But he never missed practice, right? And how Nike responded and how he responded to those things was really big, because Nike was also caught up in some scandal around labor and caught up into their process. And they just kept rising back, and they kept that mentality of failure, get hit, move forward, get hit, move forward. And so I think the last is, when you think about emotional connection identity paired with this resilience, it permeates into the team as well. And so if you could be a marketer or in any department that you're in, and remember that you're not always going to ride the top of the wave, it's going to get hard. And when it gets hard, that's where there's learning opportunities. So getting into how that silhouette becomes Jordan, and you can see this connection to brand, human, logo as an identity. We see this emotional quote here from Sonny Vaccaro, and this was in the conference room. He said this directly to Jordan. He said, everyone at this table will be forgotten as soon as our time here is up, except for you. You're going to be remembered forever because some things are eternal. Part of why he was saying that was because Michael Jordan was such an influential athlete. The other reason why he was saying that is because he knew how committed Nike was going to be to create a unique sub-identity. And to John's point around creating a shoe every year since 1985, that's insane. That level of consistency, it's like your favorite radio show or podcasts on Spotify when they say they're going to release that Friday at 1:00 and you go Friday at 1:00 and it's not there. That sense, you don't want to create those moments with your audience. Consistency is so key. Even if the episode is not as strong as the others, sometimes consistency can be the winner. So that being said, John, if you could take away game respects game, I think no one knows marketing better than you. And maybe even just your philosophy around what this means.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, I think game respect and game really is around a natural synergy between, in this instance, athlete and brand. And we sort of touched on it in a few different points earlier. This wasn't a throw of the dice, in as much as it was incredibly well considered and thought of, and a hell of a lot of selling went behind the Jordan capture from an athlete and ambassadorial perspective before they aligned on it. And ultimately, you know, again, as we easily look back at it now with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, well, of course, it was a slam dunk, but it wasn't. There was an awful lot of internal selling to be able to sort of neatly articulated a lot of what you've touched on today, Brian, around the essence and authenticity of Michael Jordan, and how that DNA, of which we've gone into in some detail today, was really of the same ilk of Nike, albeit through a slightly different lens at the time. I think, again, in as much as he's a minor character in both the movie and this story, the Phil Knight essence around the Nike brand, and being somewhat rebellious, albeit not to the same levels, clearly, as Sonny Vaccaro, is what allowed Vaccaro ultimately to bring the Nike game that we know was most definitely there, but also then match it to the Jordan personality, which we know was ultimately transformative, and a brilliant embodiment of all that Nike was about. So a really natural synergy between the two.
Phenomenal. So we're at time. I can talk about this all day. Honestly, I really do. These are the type of things that I love. It keeps me up at night. John, as always, you're brilliant. I'd like to open up to the audience any quality, any questions and answers, any Q&A that's coming in, anything people are curious about, whether it was how to be like Mike in a campaign with Gatorade, whether it was about Nike's deal that they negotiated, why we believe Jordan's powerful, the evolution of Nike. Any questions that people have when it comes to brands, fire away. We did cover a lot of this. I do want to make sure people know we will send out snippets of the recording. The slides aren't as valuable in this one because it's a lot of story, but we will send out talking points, and we'll take into kind of emotional connection, identity, how we build brands. So I do see a couple of questions coming in. First question, and John, by the way, you could jump in first if you want. First question is, do you see any brands today that embody a rebellious approach to branding?
It's a few. I mean, I might be a little bit selfish in my definition of that. I think funny we're talking about Nike in context of legacy, and I think for me, when we talk about legacy, we're talking about heritage brands who, for me, disproportionately have a tougher challenge in a very modern marketing era, of some of which you've touched on, Brian, to try and maintain their cultural relevance. So I do think that what Jameson has done in whiskey has been completely transformative. You know, when we think about what they had to transcend in order to get themselves back to the top table, taking on the likes of Jack Daniels or Chivas, etc., in the world of Scotch. Personally, you know, incredibly rebellious in order to be able to show that there is actually, in fact, a legitimate alternative to what are those well-worn, established ways of drinking whiskey. In fact, that there's another. And they've done a brilliant job at that, and that's why they're, you know, really killing it at the moment.
Yeah, and everyone, you know, when they mention whiskey, they often refer to Jameson, right? That's the whole. It's got its own identity. The rebellious nature, to me, I think the most natural example that comes to mind for me is Liquid Death. Liquid Death has taken on a category that was and is water, right? Yes, they take their water from the Himalayan Alps, which is uniquely a differentiator as it is, but they put water in a can, and having water in an aluminum can completely rebelled against what the idea of water was, having to be in a clear bottle. And in the past, what was interesting is that water brands that used blue bottles or different color bottles failed almost immediately because people thought that it had to be a clear liquid. But putting in an aluminum can, making it look like an energy drink or a beer, but also how they rebelled against normal marketing channels is, as a small brand, they said, we have a flat water or still, and we have a sparkling water. There's a black can with gold letters, white can with gold letters. Their tagline alone was murder your thirst. Murder your thirst is kind of a funny way of thinking about, I'm parched and I want to go ahead and get some liquid. But also their rebellious strategy was they put it in the hands of podcasters on the comedian side. So they targeted comedians directly and said, we want comedians that run podcasts to have Liquid Death, because we know the question is going to be, well, what are you drinking right there? And every single time the answer was the same. Oh, it's just water. And it's just water almost became and immortalized the brand in this way of like, wow. So now Liquid Death, I believe, has over 26 flavors. They're a multi-billion-dollar brand. They were able to build that in less than 5 years. They also were rebellious in their campaigns. They partnered with Travis Barker from Blink-182 and they ran a campaign called Enema of the State. And instead of Enema of the State, which was connected to the Blink-182 album, they sold 182 enemas sponsored by Travis Barker. And they were basically Liquid Death sponsored enemas and 182 for Blink-182. So you think about the campaigns they're doing, they're able to do that because they're rebels. So good question there. Next question is, oh, and by the way, just, I don't agree with everything Liquid Death does, but they are definitely a rebel. Next question from Eugene. Why Nike's Jordan is still top seller after so many years, not changing the design that much? Why other sellers like Adidas, Yeezy, Reebok's collaboration with Allen Iverson, and Puma's collaboration with Jay-Z didn't beat Nike? What are your thoughts on that? I think there's a lot of reasons. One, I think Yeezy's only tapped into one element of cultural impact, and that was Kanye was a very big name and a very disruptive, loud name. I think Adidas targeting Kanye West, they didn't connect back to say, how does this connect to Adidas's street appeal and this subculture? It was almost counterculture to everything else they were doing. And so, yeah, Kanye did go a bit off the reservation, did say some really kind of rogue things, got himself into some hot water, but it wasn't just that. It was that what he embodied wasn't exactly connected to what Adidas brand was. And I think the partnership with Allen Iverson was the same. Allen Iverson didn't consistently launch new shoes. They just had the Questions, which was the first shoe they had. And Allen Iverson didn't stand behind the brand. So when he was giving interviews, he didn't put any thought and effort back into Reebok. And I think whereas Nike specifically had elements connected to the deal. Nike said, hey, we will give you performance bonuses and we will pay out against this bonus if you win MVP, if you embody this personality. And so I think the most important thing for me that I see with Nike is this idea of consistency and finding an athlete that connected to the brand and building the brand around the athlete, whereas none of the other examples that you mentioned did that. Anything else to add on that, John?
Yeah, no, I think you summed it up really well. I think specifically on the Adidas Yeezy piece, I think probably a whole case study in the delicate balance that marketers walk around getting the right ambassador on board, because when things go wrong, in which, like you said, it's not a perfect world, they do go wrong, and it really went wrong there. I think that's a particularly difficult situation and brought down a whole sub brand. So it does sort of point to, again, as we're sort of focusing on the positive today, with again, we're looking at it now through hindsight, but the foresight that Nike were able to show is just incredible. Really sort of I can't think of anyone with that sort of 2020 vision that was able to see into the future and the way in which that marketing department did.
Yeah. And stuck to it. Like, that's amazing to keep getting wins year after year. Next question from Louise. Great webinar, really good chat. Appreciate that very much. Thank you for joining. The Air Jordan brand started targeting sports enthusiasts, but now has appeal across fashion, street culture, and lifestyle sectors. How does a brand successfully shift or expand its target audience without alienating its core consumer base? This is a phenomenal question. And I think the way that Nike has done this, as well as Air Jordan, is by connecting to an aspirational tenet. So Nike, around this idea of just do it as a phrase, I think was able to have so much stickiness and stopping power, because it could be embodied in several things. Just do it could just be cleaning your room, right? It could be getting to the gym. It could be going to that event that you feel uncomfortable about. So I think creating something that's aspirational, and then also finding the pockets and embodying just do it or aspiration in subcultures. So when you think of street culture as well, there was this idea of the mixtape, and one was a big brand around basketball shoes as well. And the mixtape was something that Nike got into early on as well, around young hip hop artists that had to record mixtapes to get them out and disseminate their music. And the mixtape took really popular beats, layered in lyrics. This was paired up with a style around Nike as well, but it came down to this idea of hustle. And hustle culture, I would argue, most people don't agree with me, but I would argue that Nike drove a lot of hustle culture, because it was this idea of like, we'll just get out and get on with it. Like, there's no stopping, there's no relaxation. And so I think brands that really do culture well, you think of Supreme as this brand that created scarcity and demand around that as well. You get into street culture by recognizing what is that cultural timing and impact, and how do you do that? It's hard to do. It's really hard to do, because ChatGPT is only going to find examples that's been done in the past. AI is only going to find examples that have been done in the past, not in the future. And to do that, I think you got to take your ear and nose to the grindstone and go out to the public and ask. A lot of brands make the mistake of not investing in research and not investing in going and asking and saying, why are everybody wearing beanies now? How come beanies became popular? And understanding that becomes a subcultural movement tied with a hipster. Well, what is a hipster? And so I think brands have to ask the question, do the research. And Nike, I believe, benefited because athletes have huge appeal, not only because they make a lot of money, but I think athletes have huge appeal because they're physically amazing specimens. And that alone is motivational. Anything to add to that, John?
I think, yeah, for me, the other piece, despite all our best intentions, they're all absolutely worthy points that you mentioned, and they're all the controllable elements of what it takes to be an erstwhile marketer. I think the other piece that you can't underestimate with the Air Jordan phenomenon is actually the uncontrollable piece. The time when all this happened, when it really sort of started to catapult into serious territory, whereby the 90s economically, far more virtuous decade for so many of us. Globalization really took hold. Americana was sort of perfectly represented, like you say, all the virtuous side. The NBA was sort of nowhere near the ceiling of what it is now. Um, Jordan was this perfect face at a perfect time in terms of exporting this newfound modern Americana into yet to be tapped into global markets. So there was a lot of stuff you couldn't possibly have planned for, and yet clearly a massive bounce in making Air Jordan hugely successful outside of the US in particular. We should remember 40% of Air Jordan sales are in the US, 60% are global. So, despite all of what we've spoken about today, which much of which would have been conceived in an era when you were trying to make Air Jordan's success in US, has actually spilled over into a global market on foot of strategy plus undefinable elements that have helped make it that big success.
And to your point about uncontrollable, it's like the virality of the video. The amount of times I've heard, oh, I want to create a viral video. Well, that ask is a really tough one because sometimes you just don't know what's going to stick, but you have to have key elements of a formula. And I also really love what you're saying, John, about uncontrollable as like, yeah, it's easy to study after the fact. It's really hard to predict. So last question here, and then we got to wrap to let everyone get back to their days. How do marketing leaders fight for a commitment to consistent campaigns in a climate where budgets are challenged? Oh, unbelievable question. I don't know is the real answer. I do not know. When budgets are challenged, it's hard to ask for a company to take a risk, tap into their line of credit, go ahead and invest into something that they're not seeing immediate returns. I don't know is the real answer, but what I do think, I have some suggestions. Some suggestions are whatever the strategy is, stick to it and don't prematurely end it, because it's hard to look at evidence procedures as if something is winning or losing until you give it time. Even something as simple as like, I'd like to improve the status of my garden or my lawn. The moment you start to neutralize the soil, it's not immediately going to get rid of all the weeds and crabgrass. You have to stick to a strategy. And if you could tap into the experts to say, what is a normal period of time where we can start to see success in paid media? What is a normal or average period of time that we can see success in creative that looks like this? And I think the other thing too is, if you have an audience of any kind, let's say you have one user of your product, one person that subscribes, treat that person as the evangelist and super user they are. Make them feel completely loved and connected, because that person will act as a vehicle. And I think what a lot of brands don't do, and part of this is the pressure of VCs and private equity, is that monthly recurring revenue or repeat customers or customer lifetime value, you hear about these things. They don't invest in the small population they know are believers and that have worked with you through evolution and gone through the mistakes and gone through the fumbling. If they love your brand, they believe in what you do, the best way when budgets are challenged is go after the folks that are buying. Because if you got a business and you're selling something, that means someone's out there buying it. Anything to add, John?
I think, yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, it's a question where, specifically me, I think of our own challenges internally, where we're asked all the time. I think, not to sound too glib about it, but I think, the business that doesn't sort of, as it pertains to marketing spend, plan for tomorrow, I would argue is possibly not here today. So, I do think, funny in the round, looking at the Nike example, even if we think back to some of the challenges for Vaccaro trying to get out the door, I mean, it was no sure thing that Air Jordan was ever going to see the light of day. And, that's a challenge on many an innovation line, which a marketer has to travel. I think depressingly, probably since 84, we're probably seeing a more risk averse marketing culture than we would have seen before. I think it's very difficult as a marketer who's coming with what would be seen as a game-changing idea, trying to balance that against, shareholder return on value, EBITDA, all of the sort of publicly limited company measures, which tend to come above game-changing ideas. So, there is no silver bullet, I think, in the answer here. I do think, to be fair, I think marketing has traveled a really strong, robust journey in recent years. We've got better around measurement and ROI. I think, to be perfectly honest, to that person sending the question, I'd be doubling down on trying to demonstrate what it is that you've done that has actually derived value to the bottom line for the company. Hence, my sort of obsession with the creative innovation piece of Air Jordan. This isn't some sort of fuzzy, warm, beautiful innovation example. It's an innovation that from year one was actually transforming the company P&L. And I think anything in that ballpark whereby you're able to demonstrate, big project or innovation or, particular undertaking project wise.
Bold and risky. We love it all.
Keep
all right.
going. Yeah.
Yeah, we're at time. John Houlihan, you are the best. I appreciate your time, energy, breath, all of it. Thanks for joining. Anybody in the audience, thank you so much. We will wrap this up. We'll take some of the salient sound bites, cut together a promo reel, give you guys the thoughts and reactions. Any questions, of course, you can reach out, and then take a look at AIB Merchant Services. Great business model. If you want to go to everwonder.com, that's ever-wonder.com, and reach out. Talk to you soon. Cheers, guys. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.